Hello, and welcome back to We're Not So Different, a podcast about how we've always been idiots. My name is Luke Waters, and I'm an amateurish historian. And as always, I am joined by Dr. Eleanor Yanniga, who is anything but. Today, we're talking about more about good old King Arthur and a guy named Geoffrey of Monmouth and all that sort of shit. But first, we have a question from one of our patrons, Ollie Kant. Says, it's been a while, but I wanted to ask a number of things. The first being this. I remember at school being told about the practice of peasants sewing themselves into their own clothing. Was this true? And if so, for what purpose? Sounds like it would get really itchy and unhygienic after a week or two.
Okay, so this is really interesting, Ollie, because I was told this the other day by someone else, and they online they were mentioning it, and they're like, yeah, we got taught this at school, and I was like, girl, what? Because no, this is emphatically not true. And for the reasons that you just named, it'd be super itchy, it'd be really unhygienic, it just doesn't make any sense, it'd be really difficult to wash. We know that medieval people wash regularly, it doesn't make any sense, right? Especially when you're involved in manual labor, like farming. If you're like wrestling with cows all the time, or say I heard this other person, they said for the winter, they wouldn't do it in the summer, but they do it in the winter, and I'm like, yeah, but you have to slaughter your pigs in the winter and stuff. You're not going to be better
sew into my long johns,
in order to get myself covered in pig blood, right? That it just wouldn't happen. What I think that this comes out of is that medieval people often have kind of the way that their clothing works is that you hold it together with ties. So they don't really have they don't have zippers or Velcro, obviously, but also not that often do they use buttons or things. So you have kind of the ties and everything. When you see a peasant girl blouse and it's got that zigzaggy thing up the middle. That. Yeah. So and you wear your clothing in separate pieces. So people have women will have a dress over the top, and men will have a tunic, and then your sleeves are separate, and then your sleeves you kind of tie them into you'll tie a little thing into the tunic that will keep your sleeve in place. And so there is a lot of kind of hooking things through things and then tying a knot, but it isn't sewing.
Yeah.
Right, it's
a lot of cinching things up,
yes,
but not
cinching's a better word. Yeah, so it's a lot of more kind of I'm attaching this to this, but you put it in a bow and you take it off. They all tend to sleep in undershirts. They have kind of undergarments and things. And you take everything off at the end of the night, and of course you do, right? Of course you do, and
of course they had the candle with the little. The candle on the thing, so they could walk around, and the cap,
the special cap, in order to get their honk shoe on,
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, and so I think that the kind of cinching things together or tying things on led to people believing the sewing thing, and then I think the sewing thing is kind of fed by the ongoing medieval people are disgusting, no one ever bathes, they do all these gross things stuff, so. This is a fairly prevalent myth, apparently, but I had just never really encountered it before this week. But I do assure you, it is a myth.
I've been racking my brain while this has been going on, trying to think about because I remember in school there being something about people being sewn into clothes, but I can't remember if it was medieval or if it was something about maybe how knights had that it doesn't seem accurate either, but somebody had been sewn into something but for a very specific purpose or whatever.
Yeah,
but,
maybe you could.
It's very hazy.
Yeah, it could certainly be something so when I got to wear armor that time, and no, I will never shut up about it. But it was
nor should you. That's cool as hell.
It's it was there'd be buckles and things that would hang bits of stuff, and there was a lot of getting cinched into the under padding and stuff like that. And maybe there would be something for if you're, I don't know, traveling through the snow for a week or something like that. But it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's not something that I've really seen in any medieval sources. So it's just kind of
Yeah. The more that I think about it, I think I remember something about this in a Song of Ice and Fire series. I'm going to DM a Game of Thrones nerd that I know and ask them, because that seems like something Martin would do, and we can blame him for this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, not really, since like if we heard about it in elementary school or whatever. For most of us, those books hadn't been written yet. But yeah.
Yeah. And listen, if they had been written when you were in elementary school, I encourage you to never fucking say that to me and Luke. Thanks.
Let me see. The first one came out in 96. No, I was in middle school then.
I mean, I was either just about in 8th grade or joining high school. So, yeah, class of 2000, bitch. A literal millennial, bitch.
Let's go. Yeah.
That's right. That's right, ho.
Yeah, look upon the ravages of age that await you, people younger than us.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. I actually like being kind of old like this.
Cool,
it's fun. To be honest, everybody shits on it, and I mean, I guess with good reason, because hey, we're gonna die. But we were
gonna die anyway.
Yep. Gonna die anyway, might as well.
I'm much less likely to die in like a Four Loko related accident in my 40s.
Now, yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing that I can say for myself.
Thank God.
So,
yeah. Four Loko consumption, full strength Four Loko in law school. Man, that was something else.
Yeah, homie.
Good, good times. Yeah.
How many medieval peasants would an original strength Four Loko kill?
No, I don't know that.
Popcorn flavor.
I'll be completely honest. That one, I think it I'll be honest, I think it might actually kill them because of the amount of fake sugar and the guanine.
I think it killed several Americans.
And alcohol. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, but like one sip and like they like experience epigenetic memories from like 15 million years ago, and all of human existence flashing before their eyes, and they just die like catatonic on the ground. Oh man, Ollie can't thank you for the question that devolved into whatever this is, but hey, that's why we're here. If you would like to ask us questions like this that occasionally talk about the times we almost got alcohol poisoning in our younger years, then do by all means subscribe to the Patreon, patreon.com/WNSDpod. You know the deal. Answer questions. You get ad-free versions of all the episodes, so you don't have to listen to that shit. And
come on to our Discord and talk about what your favorite flavor of Four Loko is.
That's correct. Also, this Friday we will be releasing our second bonus episode for the month of October, and it is we're going to review Castlevania Nocturne, the new anime series from Netflix, because we both love the original Castlevania, and we're going to talk about the first 4 episodes of the new series Castlevania Nocturne. On Friday, and then we'll do the other 2 episodes later. But if you want to hear that, check out the Patreon. It'll be cool. You get to hear us talk about lusty vampires. And, a lot of singing, a lot more singing than I expected. Not a complaint. Just
I like it. More. It's very kind of like Final Fantasy-y.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You feel me?
Yeah, I like the guy. Yeah, you just have a diegetic music box to play every time you need a battle. You need something. Yeah. All right. Well, on to the main show. It doesn't have anything to do with vampires, I don't think.
No. Some monsters.
Some monsters. That's right. And the greatest monster of all. That's right, man. Last time we started going through the earliest parts of the Arthurian canon, when we tucked into 6 pre-Galfridian stories, each written sometime between 600 and 1135 AD. Some of these focus specifically on Arthur and his exploits, while others only mention him in passing or use him as a background character, but all are viewed as contributing essential lore and world building to the Arthurian legend we know today. The earliest, of course, were 3 Welsh stories, which establish our setting and basic kinship, use other characters from Welsh folklore to burnish Arthur's credentials as a heroic and honorable guy, and link him to Welsh literature more broadly. Then we turn to 3 extant Latin writings that continue to add to the legend, but in much different ways. They heavily Christianize the character of Arthur and also begin the arduous process of portraying him as a real historical figure, creating chronicles and assigning dates and even real-world location to his feats of daring do alongside actual historical events. And yet, all of these stories seem downright foreign to the Arthur we know today.
A lot more pigs than you would expect.
yes, a lot more hunting. You know that part where Robert Baratheon gets gored by a pig? Just,
that.
Yep. The few recognizable characters that are present have earlier, unfamiliar naming conventions and different backstories, while some of the most famous aren't there at all. Until the 12th century, there is no cohesive Arthurian canon to speak of. There are a lot of things floating around, but stories are fragmented and broken, and there's no through line to any of them except that a guy named Arthur lived somewhere on the Isle of Britain. He was a leader of men and hero to some extent, and a good warrior. That's it. But all that changed in 1136 when an obscure Welsh Catholic monk decided that Arthur, whether he was real or not, was the hero the British people needed, and so decided to create a real narrative surrounding him and ground it in historical fact. The Historia Regum Britanniae, or the History of the Kings of Britain, purports to be a historical document, a Latin translation of an ancient tome written in the British tongue, and this was accepted by people for about 500 years following its publication. We now know that Arthur was not a real person and that no such ancient tome has ever been produced and almost certainly never existed. However, the sources Geoffrey did use, including Homer, Virgil, Gildas, Bede, Nennius, all of the Latin and Welsh stories we mentioned last week, the collected works of Taliesin, broader Welsh folklore, Welsh genealogical chronicles, oral tales of pre-Roman Iron Age, Celtic and Briton tribes, and his own imagination, combined myth and history in such a meaningful way that his legendary version of Arthur is still the basis for the one that we know today. He cobbled all of the source material together, used a heavy hand when editing, and created something durable that has been capturing human imagination for nearly 900 years. And that's a very rare accomplishment indeed. Yeah, so as you might have guessed, we're talking about the Galfridian era of medieval Arthurian legend, aka Geoffrey of Monmouth's 1136 magnum opus, Historia Regum Britanniae. It drastically reshapes everything we know about Arthur in such a way that it will require a whole episode, but let's start with the most pressing question. Eleanor, what the fuck does Galfridian mean?
Yeah, it's from the Latin, right? Because Galfridius is like the Latin for Geoffrey. So Galfridian is just like the highfalutin way of saying Geoffrian, right? Yeah. So nice. And Galfridius is kind of like a fairly standard fancy pants name in the 12th century in England. Like you get it more often with like Anglo-Norman families and things like this. So French speakers use it here on the Isle of Britannia.
Britannia. The light of the world. Yep. Before we talk about the work itself, let's talk about Geoffrey. What do we know about this guy?
Okay, so we think that he was alive. Our date for his birth is not good. Because the medieval things. We think he's born around 1095 or so. Dies around 1155, and he's a cleric. Which is to say, like, he's a member of the clergy initially, but that's sort of like the kind that does like university stuff. Okay. Now he's probably from Monmouth. Question, as we say, but it could be that he was in like one of the cloisters there for a while. He also sometimes his naming convention they'll call him like Geoffrey Arthur, so it's like maybe his dad's name was Arthur, or maybe they're just like oh yeah, that's the guy who writes all the Arthur fanfic.
That's the guy who really loves Arthur. Oh my God, he won't shut up.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so, but the Monmouth thing, we think he's probably from Monmouth or whatever, and so this is kind of like indicates that he's in and around kind of like Wales and what we call the Welsh borders. So he's possibly Welsh, possibly a Marcherman. It was more common to call him Welsh earlier on. Some people have kind of done some work on it now, and they say, oh, we don't know that he really was actually Welsh. But I'm just kind of like, I'm willing to give Wales this one. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't really care. Eventually, he goes on to work in Oxford, and he's probably attached to St. George's College there. And then at a point in time, he gets himself consecrated, and he's made the Bishop of St. Asaph, which is like over in Wales. But we don't think that he ever actually went there, which is kind of like very much a style of the time sort of thing. Like you would get a benefice or a position or something like that, and then you never do anything with it. It's something that like reformers are always complain about. And we think that's probable because at this point in time over in Wales, you have the revolts that are being led by Owen Gwynedd. So like there's a lot of war, and he's like Mr. writing about Arthur guy, so probably not. So yeah, like he's kind of like a career churchman, and the thing that he does is he writes these big books and kind of ponces around and neglects his duties. So a relatable king, right? Good for him.
Yeah. So when he was writing this, did he have any idea of the scope and scale of what he was doing at the time?
I think this is really a great question because it's like maybe, because he's telling you this story that is, you could say uncharitably, you could just call it a lie, right? You could just say it's a lie because he's like, oh, I found a dusty old tome and I translated it, for my masters here at Oxford. But obviously that isn't what it is, right? It's a compilation of all of the texts that you talked about in the introduction that we talked about before. And it's like winds these strands together, and then also, like other kind of chronicles about the history of Britain and things like that. But what saying that it's a translation of is it does give it credence, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, it seems like he's trying to scam, but who knows? Maybe it's just kind of like, the equivalent of the Blair Witch Project or something for the Middle Ages, where he's like, you're supposed to know that he's making it up and that it's not real. And he's all like he's doing like found footage, history of Britain, and like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I translated this, but it's so. I mean, whether or not he knew it would take off like this, I think is another question. But so it's like, did he know that he was going to like change the course of the way that we talk about the history of Britain, and that like people would be camping outside of Stonehenge in caravans waiting for Arthur Pendragon to return from underneath Stonehenge in the year of our Lord 2023? Probably fucking not, bro. Probably not. But I've seen that shit with my own eyes. So, yeah.
He's coming back one day, baby. One day to save Britain. I don't know how much worse you could get to, from its lowest point, but one day. Yeah. I'm like, I don't know how it's supposed to get anywhere, but anyway. Yep. Yeah. So what are there any other outstanding writings from old Geoff?
So Geoff's main things are like Arthuriana, right? Because he also wrote like the Prophecies of Merlin, which gets bound into Kings of Britain, as we'll get into. And this is kind of like, here's all the like, it's like Nostradamus but Merlin, which is cool. And then you also have the Vita Merlini. Which is a bit more of a compilation. It kind of takes strands of a bunch of kind of folklore about Merlin, gives it some narrative heft. It's a poem, and it gives you like more of a biography of Merlin more specifically. So he may have done other things, but like my man knew he had one talent, and kind of that's what we associate with him. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, moving on to the book itself, the Historia Regum Britanniae, and it's kind of a mixed historical document. Mm-hmm. I guess you could also call it pseudo historical if you wanted to. But like, let's start by talking about the phantom ancient Britain language source that Geoffrey supposedly translated this from. What do we know about it, and why do most academics believe no such source ever existed?
Okay, so the first thing that kind of like came up with this is this thing called the Bruticilio. Okay. And this was, it alleged to be a 7th century document that was attributed to the Welsh saint Tysilio. Okay. And basically people found this and were like, haha, this proves Geoffrey right. This must have been what he had been translating. And look, it's in Welsh. So this makes sense. This kind of like accords to the narrative that we've been given, right? Thing about this is we think it's actually the other way around. And it's like that, and that was kind of like an intentionally, it was a piece of text that was made to look intentionally old, and that it was based off of the stuff that Geoffrey had been writing, right? And we consider the Brut Tysilio to be part of the larger collection that we call the Bruti Brenhinef, which they are all variant Welsh versions of the Historia Regum. Exactly, basically. So there's around 60 of them that survive, which is rather a lot. They're all in Welsh. So basically it's kind of like, oh, people really liked the, Historia Regum, and then they were like, let's get a Welsh version popping off. And then people later, when they wanted to like prove that Geoffrey was right, then saw those Welsh versions that are a lot like that are a lot like the Historia Regum, and they're like, oh, see, there it is. But it's but it's backwards, right?
Yeah. So, it was kind of famously treated as a historical document in the Middle Ages, and then, kind of got openly debunked in the 16th century. But there were skeptics before that, huh?
Yeah. So, like, a shout out to like the 2 skeptics that we have on record. One of them is William of Newburgh, and he was so mad about this. He wrote a lot about it. And, so in 1190 he wrote, "It is quite clear that everything this man wrote about Arthur and his successors, or indeed about his predecessors from Vortigern onwards, was made up partly by himself and partly by others." Okay. Great.
That's awesome. I love how mad this guy, he's like, I fucking hate the stories he included. That's not how Arthur was in my head.
And he's like, this is not real. It's not real, which is very funny. There's also your man, Geraldus Cambrensis, or, Gerald of Wales. And he's got this hilarious story where he does this like very roundabout way of casting shade, where he's talking about like someone who's possessed by demons. And they're like, oh yeah, this guy's possessed by demons. And when we put a holy Bible on his chest, he would like stop convulsing and like the demons all flew out of him. But then we went and put a copy of the Historia Regum Britanniae on him, and the devils all came back, and there were more of them, which is like a shady way of saying, that
satanic panic. Yeah. Gerald, how dare you?
And he's like, basically, Gerald's a liar, right? And the demons will all flock to this false history, and I think that is a very hilarious.
Yeah.
And very shady way of doing things. But having said that, these guys are outliers. And people want it to be real. Okay?
Yeah.
So, and notably in this, you got 2 monks, Robert of Torgny and Henry of Huntingdon, who they swap manuscripts in the 12th century of it. And they're both chroniclers. So they're like, yes, great source material. Like, here we go. Now I can like make and embellish my chronicles even more. And then so they start making chronicles that say all this is right. And then people go, oh, okay, well, here's the dates on that. That's fine. And it kind of makes sense. You got to understand from a European context, like outside of Britain, because, if you go tell someone in the German lands, yeah, that's what was going on up in Britain. They're like, oh, okay. They're like wizards. Sure, man. I don't know what the fuck's going on up there. Yeah, seems legit.
And they got wizard jets.
Yeah,
their brains too much. They probably do have wizards.
Yeah,
what else are you gonna do up there?
Yeah, I'm like, they're out there making magic or whatever. Right. So and it does kind of really kind of go on like this up until the 16th century. The 16th century, notably, they have a real interest in kind of like debunking things. So it's like, you start getting, for example, like the donation of Constantine debunked. And stuff like this, where it's like people are like, you know what? We're starting to think about things differently, and that's not helpful anymore, and we don't like it. And so, finally people start to critique it.
Yep. Yeah, I like, just people willing things into existence because they think it's cool. They're like, yep, these chroniclers just, throwing stuff in there because they're like, yeah, we love this Arthur guy. He's great, and then like that's history for, hundreds of years. That's cool. Despite the stuff about Arthur being ahistorical, Historia does contain a good bit of real history, mostly because of Geoffrey's use of real genealogical chronicles and King's List, mostly from Wales.
Yeah. Like it's the thing that Geoffrey did was make a really excellent compilation. Like it does include things that are historical fact. And in fact, there was a big study that was done on this in 2017 out of Bournemouth Uni here, where they went through everything and they're like, actually, like archaeological evidence suggests that a lot of things that he kind of mentions in an offhand way are true. Granted, there are fictional elements to it. Did Brutus come to Britain and, kill a race of giants? Probably not. Is Arthur real? No. But there are, the historical things that are actually in there are kind of real. And that's because he was using real sources that were written down. But this is so standard for medieval texts and like medieval chronicles. You'll see this stuff happen all the time. Where it's kind of like a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. And that's why we tend to call things chronicles and less histories, right? Where it's like, and even then these things are usually written at the behest of people, right? So if you're a king or whatever, and you say, I want a chronicle or I want a history, the guy who's writing it is going to be like, and then this king's family was really great. Everyone was like, oh, I really hope that I can be this king's subject. He's such a nice guy. Like that's what's going on. So that is kind of what's happening in the Historia Regum as well, is that he's using these historical things that he knows to be true. He's using stuff that Bede and all this stuff like that he knows is a fact. And then he's putting in the myth that British people want, right? They want these things to kind of normalize them, and they want these things that are going to tell their story as they see it, and kind of like give them a magical pedigree. And so, there you go, right?
Yeah, it's I find it really interesting as like a quasi historical thing, because the more the more familiar I get with like Herodotus and stuff, it is fascinating the like real stuff he throws in there alongside stuff that like is just like obviously like at the very least a tall tale, but almost certainly just like bullshit or gossip he heard, or like literally in one point he cites like his cousin's like third-hand info from a guy 2 towns over twice removed.
It's like,
and you get that, and people, and Herodotus is like, the Athenians found ancient race of giant bones or whatever, and it's like, okay, bro, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, man.
It's very like they were in the closet making babies, and I saw one of the babies, and the baby looked at me, and you're like, word? Okay. All right.
That is basically what he did about the Persians. He's like, oh, they were so awful and greased up and
stupid,
and
sexy
hot.
Persians.
Stupid, sexy Persians. We had to kill them all, except for the ones that killed us. Anyway, don't look it up. And just, one other thing that I learned that I thought was cool, I was doing research, is Historia contains the earliest known version of the King Lear story, which is cool.
Yeah, it's just neat. It's like, okay, homie. Cool.
So either he made it up or someone was already telling it and he brought it in.
Yeah.
Either way,
it's cool.
Shit.
It's cool.
Yep.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's an undoubtedly cool document. Right.
Yeah.
Like, I'm kind of talking shit because I'm like, don't try to pass this off as history. But on the other hand, I love it. Yeah. I love it though.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think there's a difference between being like, just like stating matter of factly, this is obviously not a historical document. Arthur's obviously not a real person. Now, all of that being said, you can glean so much from it, like sociologically, culturally, linguistically, I'm sure, and all that sort of stuff. And, it's still really cool. It's obviously people still think it's cool because we're still talking about Arthur like that today, and still doing adaptations of King Lear. So So yeah, let's talk about Arthur before we talk about what exactly happens in the book. So like, what does this do for the story of Arthur?
So this kind of creates the figure of Arthur as we know him, right? So you've got your Welsh tradition, which, as we were talking about last time, it's a lot more magic kettles and there's a guy trapped in a glass wall and let's go kill a boar. And Arthur is often kind of ancillary to things going on around him. But it takes all of those Welsh things and then he monks it up a bit, like a lot more of the Latin Christian tradition. And then he puts it in this historical framework, which gives this all credence, right? So then he says, okay, and I can tell you when all of this happened, and here's the order. It's not just long ago and far away. I'm telling you it happened then, right? Mm-hmm. So it's got the magic, right? Which is what everybody wants. Like everyone's here for the magic, but it's also puts this Christian gloss on it, which also makes it okay to enjoy it. Right. So, by the time we're in, the 12th century, we're in the high Middle Ages here. And it's a lot more like monks need to be explaining why they're writing stories about wizards or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he manages to do that really well. And it's like, bada bing, bada boom, you got the warrior King Arthur. Right.
Yeah.
And like it turns it much more into a fairy tale with a narrative like we would expect to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it gives it like a structure, defined timeline, from the fall of Troy, of course, because it's the most important thing in history.
Obviously.
Which, the real fall of Troy would have been sometime in the 11th century BC.
Yeah.
All the way through the Roman occupation of Britain, which lasted until like the 300s?
Yeah.
400s, something like that. And then the fictional Battle of Camlan, which happened in the early 6th century AD, according to this.
Yeah.
And I like that. Like, nope, here's your timeline.
Yep.
Here's what happened. We got it. We got the linear narrative settled out. Now we can just flesh out the bones around this.
Yeah.
And go nuts.
And it's like, so that's really important because it is, the backbone of the lore that he creates, right? And see, that's the other thing that he does is he's like, motherfucker brings the cast. Yeah. Right. He brings and he's like, now let me name some guys, and it's not just like the random 5 that we were talking about before, like your Gwaines and your Kays and everything, right? That your Bedivirs, right? You get a lot more Knights of the Round Table. You get a lot more villains, like, oh, here's a bad guy. A lot more bad guys, which is very exciting. And, a lot of backstory that kind of explains how we get to Camelot in the first place. I mean, he gives us Camelot, right?
Yeah.
Like, as we traditionally think of it.
Yeah. He gives us Arthur being a cuck.
Yeah, getting cooked.
Or at least the earliest version we have of it.
Well, I mean, it's just so high medieval, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing, is that he's such a product of his time. It's like, if you're gonna do an updated adaptation of Arthur, it's like, well, he's got to get cucked.
Yeah.
I mean,
oh yeah, duh.
Like, that's where the romance is, baby. So, you get that. You get that.
Yeah. Yeah,
and then
and he does us all a favor. He creates Merlin basically from whole cloth, or he combines other stories and just puts Merlin in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Arthur's, probably the second most famous character in here. Just there he is.
Yep.
Thanks, Jeff.
And we love him, and we love Merlin. So that's exciting. Like, that's a really, really good one. And, there are these kind of like other stories about magical Welsh wizards. He pulls them together. He gets you your Merlin biography. And, I mean, I think a lot of us kind of think of the Merlin stuff as actually the most exciting bit. Like, I mean, I don't know. I say a lot of us. Like, for me, I dig it because I think that all kind of like the demon dad backstory and like the, getting trapped by a sexy priestess and all that. Like, that's cool, right? Merlin's cool as hell, right?
Yeah. And that Historia a lot of times gets the Prophecies Merlin stuck in there, the 7 Prophecies of Merlin. Yeah. And so, then you get the Historia itself, and we're going to talk about it, for the rest of the episode. It can be broken up kind of
into books.
Into 12 books, and the first 6 are usually grouped together, and then they put the Prophecies of Merlin in there at 7, and then 8 through 12 are together kind of in time. And oddly, Arthur doesn't appear until book 9.
Yeah.
So there's if you're one of those people who's like, oh man, this ain't going to be like a lot of useless backstory about stuff before you get to the main character. This is absolutely a bunch of useless backstory.
Oh God, yeah.
Main character.
Yeah.
Yeah. So book 1, Eleanor, what's happening here?
This shit about Brutus. Okay. And so, actually, it starts off hilariously, and it's just like a really dry topography of Britain at first. And it's all like, it's abundance in minerals. It's got great springs and rivers. Its coal output is, it's very much, it reads kind of like a school report on a country or something. Then he talks about the 5 tribes that inhabit the island. So the Normans, the Britons, the Saxons, the Picts, and the Scots. He says that the Britons were the first ones here, but they're arrogant, so basically God wanted to punish them. Basically then that brings us to the story of Brutus, right? And Brutus, if you know your Greek and Roman mythology, is the great grandson of Aeneas, right? So Aeneas was a Trojan, fled Troy, and founds Rome. One of the versions, please ignore Romulus and Remus or whatever the hell, right? And there was like a prophecy about Brutus that he was destined to kill both of his parents, wander in exile, and then eventually rise to the highest honor. So his mom dies in childbirth. He accidentally kills his dad on a hunting expedition. He gets kicked out, wanders around Greece. There are hijinks, right? Like basically goes and like rescues people from captivity and things like this, and eventually like ends up getting into a boat and coming to Britain, right? There's some other islands along the way. It does not necessarily matter for our purposes here. He goes to Aquitaine. He fights some Trojans. He and the Trojans fight some people, and eventually he gets to Albion. And other than the giants that are here, it's uninhabited. And he's like, oh, look at the coal exports, the minerals, the bogs.
Man, that's a lot of coal.
Yeah,
woo!
Coal. And like, we are ready to build some homes, right? And so he names the island Britain and calls them all, like all of the Trojans who came over, the Britons, so that, quote, his memory should be perpetuated by the derivation of the name. So... says that nice. Basically everything's after him. He's like, this is the new Troy. Abidi babidi ba, right? So basically this is a way for English people / British people to make themselves a nice kind of Trojan pedigree. Right? It does exactly what you think it's doing. It's just saying, here's our connections. This is how people got here. We're as important as anyone else. Things of this nature, right?
Yeah. And that takes us to book 2.
Yes.
The death of Brutus.
Yeah.
Rip.
So Brutus has 3 sons, Lacronius, Camber, and Albinactus. He dies. His sons divide up the kingdom, and they're like ruling pretty peacefully until the king of the Huns, Humber, comes into Albinactus's region, which is Albany, and kills him. And everyone is like, oh shit, runs away, right? So the other brothers they create an alliance to chase off Humber. He eventually drowns in a river. That's how the river Humber gets its name. Basically there is a lot of talking about carousing with the ladies. So Lacronius is like a ladies' man. He reserves 3 women of striking beauty from Humber's, like the spoils of Humber. One of them is called Estrildis. He wants to marry her, but he already promised that he was going to marry Cronius's daughter Gwendolen. So instead he hires Estrildis in a cave. She has like a bastard, they like standard, right? Yeah. His wife is not happy about this, especially when he leaves her for Estrildis and is like, she's the queen now. So Gwendolen gets together an army, fights it, kills him in battle, and then Gwendolen rules for 15 years, which is cool. Yeah, and so that's nice. So anyway, like, sons take over. A lot of infighting, a lot of brothers killing brothers. You got tyrannical reigns over the island. Dudes named Nempricius who have like 20 wives, which is a good way to get like a new group of people started. And so, then there's a lot of just like, and then he begat him, and then he begat him, and then they fought over this. And then it's like, it's pretty, let's put it this way, it's dry, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's like, it's supposed to be about 1,000 years of history, right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot like reading the earlier parts of the Bible where it's all begat, right?
Yeah.
And so, but what it's really kind of doing is saying, here's a narrative that you can have to understand what was going on here alongside the other things that are happening in other parts of the world where we have a history for them. Right. So like, and it's funny because he's got like a lot of detail in things in this, which kind of is like meant to make it look authentic, but I'm like, homie, how could you know? Right.
Yeah.
And maybe he made this up, or maybe it's from other sources or whatever, but it's like, whatever. It's just kind of like basically kind of saying this is what's going on in Britain, so you can understand that it is part of Europe. Like this is what you need to understand is happening alongside all the stuff that you actually know that's cool elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
And this is also where we get King Lear. So
nice.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Woo! King Lear. Yep. And then book 3.
Yeah, so book 3, the Romans show up. Way. Hello, Romans. So basically, your man Julius Caesar conquers Gaul. He's like, I'm going to go over to that boring island. I bet it doesn't have rabbits yet. Chickity bow. Now it does, right? Or whatever. So basically, he's like, oh, I'm going to send a letter saying we're coming over because I know that they are also descended from Trojans just like us. Real recognize real. Like, strongo. And then so he sends a letter over, and Cassivellaunus is like, get fucked, I'm also a Trojan, you can't come and like get off my lawn. Caesar attacks him anyway. Cassivellaunus like attacks back, spirited defense, but eventually they all get defeated. So like Cassivellaunus' brother Nennius gets killed by Caesar, but like he drives Caesar off. Question mark. Caesar goes back to Gaul with his troops, and the Gauls rebel, and then Caesar has to like buy off the locals, whatever, things like that. And then Caesar comes back. It's like Caesar 2, to Caesar, to Furious, exactly. So the Romans lose again, even though they're very brave. It's like, this is, and I'm like, that's funny. Then eventually Cassivellaunus dies, and like that when he does, they're like, okay, well, like he and Caesar just made friends, right? And it was just like, sure, yeah, the thing that Caesar was known to do. You like basically then you have a new king on the throne, Tinvantius. Jesus is born at the same time, so there you go. And he's kind of friendly with the Romans. And, things of this nature. So it's then turns into kind of like a little potted Roman history, right? And then it's like eventually like the kings kind of turn their backs on Rome and start looking down their noses on it. That's very bad, right? But then also you start to have Christians show up. So Pope Eleutherius sends up some missionaries in order to Christianize Lucius. And then everyone converts very quickly because they just love it. And like we're talking about like around like the 150s. Like, yeah, sure, bro, sure, yeah, everyone's Christian. Yeah, definitely wasn't happening in like the 6th century or something. No, okay, cool. So Lucius eventually dies without an heir. So then like the Britons are fighting the Romans. So then they're like, the Romans send in big like fleets. You get what I'm saying. It's just like, basically it's a lot of like, oh, are they Roman? Are they not? Like, oh, look, the Gauls are easily subdued, but not us British people. Yeah, and like, Eventually, Maximianus, who's the king, is like down on the continent fighting, and so as a result of this, the Picts kind of get word that Britain is empty. So the Picts and the Huns invade, kill everyone, and then basically lots of people come in, attack from Ireland, and the Scots attack, and the Norwegians and Danes attack, and there's all of these things, right? So basically then all the bad people, aka not Romans, so your Picts, your Scots, etc., are claiming everyone, and basically it's supposed to be oh yeah, Romans good, Celts bad, things of this nature. And eventually, the bad / mad king Maximianus is killed, and Britain gets overrun. And it's that's what you get for getting too above yourself, right? Kind of deal, and thinking that you can run off.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that included book 4 as well.
Yeah, we got the houses of Constantine in book 4.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much more of the same. But you get a little bit more of there was this king, and there was this king, and there was this king, and there was this king. And then what you start getting in book 4, though, is that you start getting Arthur's direct ancestors. And he starts putting Merlin's prophecies in there. So it's oh yeah, here's a succession crisis. Here's the civil discord that Arthur has to come take over, right? Constantine wants to take over the crown of Britain. He marries a local woman. And then one of his sons with her is Uther Pendragon, who's Arthur's father. So it's there you go. Arthur is related to fucking Constantine. Sure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then Constantine dies, and then that's when Vortigern shows up, and he's okay, well, there's this uncertainty around succession, and we're going to kind of try to take advantage of that, right? And then it turns into kind of Saxon pagan versus Christian Britain story. Right. And then this is when you get the white dragon and red dragon prophecy, where the dragons are fighting each other. And then you get your Merlin.
Woo!
So Vortigern eventually runs away to Wales, and you find Merlin. Vortigern is oh, why can't I build the tower? Remember, we talked about that last time. There's the whole thing about the tower that is always falling over. And then in that one, you had a Roman, but in this one it's Merlin is oh, that's your red dragon and your white dragon that are wrestling under the hill. So that's book 4. So you see, it slows down a little bit. It's not so much like all the other ones where it's this guy, because it's kind of bringing you into what the narrative is.
Yeah, and so then books 5 and I guess 6.
Yeah. Okay. So it's get ready for some Merlin. It's so this is in this part you got Merlin, and he's hey, what's up? And Vortigern's men are going to find 2 stones. Each of them contains a sleeping dragon. Then Geoffrey talks about himself for a while. He breaks the 4th wall. And he's while I was working on this chronicle, I received a request from Alexander to translate the prophecies of Merlin. So here we go.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about this, book 7 and this part, is that the narrative just stops to be and this is a good time and any to do these. And these are just a direct translation. I definitely did not make these up. He's got quotation marks around this shit.
Oh, fancy.
And he's so he's not I didn't condense it. I didn't combine it. This is just what I translated. Interesting. There's they're quite mythological, but they're not Christian. But they are a lot like the Apocalypse / the Book of Revelation. Okay. Right. whatever, dude, which, of course gives them credence. And so then it's like, oh, see, Merlin's got these mystical abilities. Damn, how did he know all of that stuff, right? And then he is able to kind of predict things that are going to happen for the next 3 generations. And then after that, he's like an unspecified length of time, right? And so, what that does is that then when Geoffrey introduces the other histories, everyone goes, "Oh shit, that's the thing that Merlin said." And we can tell what some of them are, but some of them are like, "Homie, I don't know what you're talking about," right? Because it seemed important to them and it doesn't seem important to us. So it's quite cute. Yeah. It's cute, that one.
Oh man. These prophecies, they're too real. They're too real for the streets. The streets don't even understand them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So yeah, Prophecies of Merlin is a lot of times included in book 7, and then we get to book 8, and finally we start getting to almost kind of Arthur, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, so it's back to the good part, right? So basically, Vortigern is like, damn, those are really cool in Prophecies, Merlin. Thank you so much for giving them to me, right? And then, so basically, you then get the stage set for Arthur at this point in time. Okay, so it focuses on the reigns of Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon, right? So that's Arthur's uncle, and it's his father. And then Geoffrey kind of goes back to his whole fucking, detailed battles thing. Like he does with Brutus in part 1. And it's just very hey, would you believe it, these British kings are brave, and they're pious and skilled,
so pious
and noble, right? So it's basically these are just the qualities of any epic heroes that you would see, it like Odysseus or anyone like that, except that they're also Christian, right? And then lo and behold, Aurelius and Uther Pendragon managed to defeat the Saxons. And they restore peace to Britain. Fantastic, right? What's interesting is that those two don't fight in power struggles between themselves. Aurelius Ambrosius is the king, and Uther Pendragon is okay, cool. Yeah. Whatever you want, homie. I'll be here being your brother and not a dickhead, right? Eventually, Aurelius Ambrosius dies. He's sad about it, even though he becomes king. And then, Britain prospers, and the brothers get buried at Stonehenge. Aww. Bless. We love that. So, we then also have Merlin get reintroduced, because there's kind of a side plot where Uther Pendragon falls in love with someone's wife, Gorlois' wife, Vergenna. And so Merlin is like, hello, I'm here to make sure that you understand that Arthur's birth is magic, right? And that this bastard child is magic. So here we go. So he transformed Uther Pendragon into Glorious's double. We talked about this. And then the uncharitable would say Rafe Sirgena. I mean, that's, I would say that, but okay. It's supposed to be romantic, whatever. And so this is Merlin's last big kind of narrative appearance here. But it's bada bing, bada boom. That's how you get Arthur, right? So after he allows Uther Pendragon this, he disappears. And he's all like, my work here is done.
I have to go back to my home planet.
Exactly. So what's really interesting is that Merlin's responsible for Arthur's birth in the Geoffrey of Monmouth stuff, but they don't really interact directly in Geoffrey's versions of things. It's he's there, but it's not that important, right?
Yeah, he's there, but they aren't buddies or enemies or whatever.
Yeah.
And then book 9, finally, Arthur. He's here.
Woo. All Arthur, all the time. So, okay, basically, Arthur gets crowned at a young age. Everybody loves him because, get this, he's very virtuous and very skilled, if you can believe it.
No.
I know, right? Would you believe that Arthur is the embodiment of Christian piety?
No. Would you absolutely not.
Would you believe he was skilled in war? just like all the epic heroes.
Come on.
It's crazy.
Come on.
It's crazy.
This sounds too good to be true.
Right. So it's like he's always good at war, but after he wins a battle, he's very merciful. So he treats the Saxons and Picts and Scots very well after he kicks their asses. Right. He also spends a bunch of time restoring churches that the Saxons have burned down, showing that he's a good Christian guy. So like he much is made of his ability to kind of like strike a balance between conquering distant lands and actually paying attention to what's going on at home. Right. Like hint, hint to the past kings couldn't make that work. Right. So he's feared and revered all around the world. Right. Also enter Guinevere. Okay. And Guinevere, we're supposed to understand, is a descendant of Roman nobility. Okay. So, sure. Right. So there you go. More links to Rome.
She's so fancy.
Arthur then obviously goes to conquer Gaul. Duh.
Obviously.
And then he comes back to Britain for Pentecost, or the celebration of Whitsuntide. And that's the seventh Sunday after Easter, if you're counting. And it's when, the disciples learn to talk in tongues. And so he, on this day, receives an envoy from the Roman Lucius Tiberius, and where Lucius is like, Arthur, you don't jack off to Rome enough, and I encourage you to stroke it to Rome.
You're not enough of a weeb for Rome.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And Arthur is like, well, Belinus and Berenius, who once captured Rome, that was bad. What Britain is supposed to be Rome's equal, because we both dominated each other at some point in time. So Julius Caesar came over here. We went over to Rome. Abadi babadi ba. Just to make it clear, Lucius Tiberius is not real. We don't know whether Geoffrey invented him, or if like it was in one of the sources. And also, crucially, by the time that Arthur was supposed to be reigning, Western Rome was donezo, right?
Yeah.
Like he would have been writing down to fucking, I don't know, Theodocur or something, like that. Like,
Porphyriatos.
Yeah, somebody like that, So, Lucius is then kind of like a stand-in for Rome or anyone who's theoretically in competition with Britain, which lol. So it might just be kind of like making pointed remarks about the Holy Roman Empire, possibly. And so it's like, but you're supposed to understand that they are equals to Rome, right? There are some battles. It's equal. Arthur's victorious, although he like gets lucky. So that's kind of like, oh, see, God wants Britain to prosper or whatever. And then there is a like direct contrast between the wisdom of Arthur and the folly of Maximianus, right? So it's like when Maximianus like took all the soldiers off to the continent, and then Britain got overrun with foreigners. Arthur never did that. He cancels an invasion of Rome to come back to Britain when he hears that Mordred has assumed kinship and is cucking him with Guinevere. Yeah, so like be your own son sometimes. So basically Arthur's like battle our army, who are very Christian, battle Mordred's kind of Christian / pagan forces 3 times. The third confrontation, both of them are wounded. Mordred dies. Arthur disappears to the Isle of Avalon. And then question mark.
Oh.
Right? Yeah.
And then, so book 10.
Oh yeah, book 10. So here we are at the Saxon domination. Is what you kind of get to now. So, so Arthur's dead. So you get through in this bit about 2 centuries after Arthur goes to Avalon. Okay, so this is like Britain is declining because of its own flaws. Okay, and eventually the Saxons by this point have more wisdom than the Britons, and they rightfully outstrip them and get control of the island. Right. So the idea here is that within these books, you see the British kings and priests behave in ways that God doesn't like. Mm-hmm. So Arthur's nephew, Constantine, who like takes over from his uncle, slaughters all of Mordred's sons at the altars that they were seeking refuge at.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's not great. The Kedrick, who is like one of the big leaders, is like fomenting civil war. Your man Dinut says that he's not going to preach Christianity to his enemies. He's just going to kill them because then it makes it easier to kill them. But at the same time, the Saxons are combining forces, also alongside like Gormund and Isambard, and they're so they're doing kind of strength through unity thing. Eventually, you get to Cadwallo and his son Cadwallader, name alert. And they want kind of like peace and stability in their reigns, but Cadwallader falls ill. The Britons kind of like descend into civil war. And then Geoffrey is like, once again, it's time for a message. Like, we've all had a lot of fun today, but it's important to remember that the Britons were foolish and self-destructive, and they deserved what they got, basically, kind of thing. So, like, for the rest of the book, Geoffrey is like, it was the divine intention for Britain, like, to kind of get to where it is today. There's these kind of mystical, mythological things, but there's also kind of like cautionary things. So he's like, there will be plague and there will be famine. There will be civil war. Cadwallader eventually sails to Brittany and can't come back to Britain, despite the fact that he wants to. An angelic voice that's accompanied by thunder confirms that God is angry with the Britons. and is like, you stay your ass in Brittany, Cadwallader. No one likes you. And then, like, after a period of penance, the Britons are going to be able to return to their island. And this is something that, like, Merlin's prophecies dictated, surprisingly. In this bit, what's interesting is that Geoffrey mentions specific dates and years here at the end of the book. So he's like, it's 689 and Cadwallader has died. Like, his son and his nephew spend 79 years trying to capture the island again, but they can't do it. While the Saxons are like keeping peace among themselves and cultivating their communities. And what's notable about that 79 years is that 79 years after 689 would be like 768. So that's when Charlemagne is crowned king of the Franks.
Oh.
Do you see? So it's like, do you see what's going on over there? You see? Well, he's consolidating power, and you guys, and then and also it's like, before he would become Holy Roman Emperor. So basically, like, the book kind of ends with a summing up of like they did it to themselves, because if we understand the entire kind of purpose of the book as being about like the reasons why they are like Arthur is good, and it being about how it is that they come to rule and all the mystical things that God wants, then like you need to explain what's going on, right? So like this is all like a big fast forward through what's going on, but like, oh my God, homeboy just goes on. He really does.
He just keeps talking. Keeps talking. Books, just the last two books after Arthur's death, it's just like, and this guy. The Britons are so awful. Don't you hate how awful they are? I fucking hate them.
This angel says, like books 11 and 12 are like, this angel says that the fucking Brits suck. Although, Cadwallader, excellent name for a cat.
Yeah.
Get yourself a little tuxedo cat. Call it Cadwallader, I reckon.
That's right.
Yeah. So, basically.
That is, So, I mean, I guess, like, summing this up, it does seem kind of surprising in hindsight that Arthur is the big, huge thing that we take out of this, because he's really only there for, like, books 9 and 10, and, like, he's successful in war, but gets cucked by his own nephew, and loses his throne and then dies in Camlin and is escorted to Avalon with, whatever.
Yeah, it's just kind of like, I think that everybody likes the Arthur stuff the best because, he is put off as like, here's like the ideal king. Blah, blah, blah. So he's definitely put forward as that. There's a lot more detail about other homies, but it's like boring, because there's a lot less magic, right? And there's a lot more Jeff slew Steve.